Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Series, where the goal isn't to teach you new best practices, but to help you consistently execute the ones you already know, even when pressure rises. Many leaders have spent decades building experience, judgment, and skill. You've read the books, you've managed teams, you know what good leadership looks like. And yet, under pressure, you don't always execute the way you know you can. Maybe not you, but you can probably think of someone who fits this. It's easy to assume that the gap is about knowledge, personality, or habit. But what if it isn't? In sports, when a seasoned athlete suddenly tightens up in a critical moment, we don't say they forgot how to play. We call it choking. The skill is there. The breakdown happens under pressure. Early activation of the stress response disrupts execution before conscious thought has a chance to stabilize it. Leadership is no different. What most people think of as my thinking is often a narrative built after a rapid physiological shift. Again, at the nervous system level, we're talking physiological, cognitive processing, not your conscious thought. In milliseconds, the brain evaluates threat, shifts state, and narrows bandwidth. By the time you're explaining your reasoning, your state has already shaped what you can access. Your flexibility, your tone, your listening, judgment. It's the disparity between the nervous system reaction and your conscious mind engagement. This talk pulls back the curtain on that sequence, not to suggest you need more knowledge, but to examine whether what you experience as limits in your thinking are actually limits in early recovery before the conscious mind sets in. Because if the constraint is state, not intelligence, then change remains available. Similar to the athlete who choked, more skill how to hit the ball may not be what's needed. It's about the state. That said, yes, you can hit the ball enough times to where the system becomes so robust that the threshold is higher to disrupt it, but it still remains. You take an athlete who gets into an uncomfortable situation, something they didn't prepare for, and you'll see the same behavior happen again because the stability is more important than the repetition. You need both. And that's a very different conversation. There's three things to keep in mind as we enter the discussion. Leadership is an open skill performance, unlike sports. You can't rehearse every conversation, every disruption, every unexpected moment the way that athletes do. That shifts the leverage point from repetition to recovery speed, and that's the point. Most of us evaluate our leadership in controlled environments. You take a workshop and you do some role play. Volatility exposes whether your stability travels with you or disappears when conditions change. When you don't show up with what you know, the issue is rarely intelligence. It's often the stress activation moving faster than stabilization. And that's the backdrop for this. Let's go and just do a quick illustration to pull things together. Now, if you've seen any of this content before or related content, you know that we talk about the separation between the subconscious or the network of neurons and the conscious mind. And if you have the two separate systems here, and I say they're separate because on the network of neurons side, that's cognitive processing. This is not conscious thought. Cognitive processing is not the same as thought. Now, for years, for centuries, it was thought to be the same. And that's because energy is going through the neural pathways and thought is energy. And so there's some similarities, but they are definitely different. The, the network of neurons passes off to the conscious mind and it transitions from the signal that's going through the neurons to something that can be perceived by the conscious mind. And this is about a half second. Conscious mind comes online in about a half second. The network of neurons has two parts of it, actually three. There's a pre-listening part where it's just assessing the environment and predicting what's likely to come up in that situation. And then there's a quarter second here and a quarter second here. This first quarter second is the reaction time of the network of neurons. If you look up what's the reaction time of the subconscious, that's what you'll get. But what you'll what you'll want to dig into is that there is actually stuff going on here in that quarter second. It's not just waiting because it's slow. It's actually processing, and it's doing some initial detection. It's deciding the path of least resistance. It's looking at meaning and things of that nature. And the what happens is that the sooner you can get it here, because this is traveling and this is measured in milliseconds, the sooner we can stabilize here and recover and stabilize versus letting the stress response take off running, the bigger the impact is that we'll have and the less effort it takes. So if I did a graph, this graph is effort and this graph is impact. And this is, this is time. So let's call this 0. That's a stimulus. And this is T minus 100. So the pre-listening is that pre-period. And then what we have is, we'll call this a second. And on impact, on impact, the earlier you get it, the greater the impact. As you reach the conscious mind side, the impact drops down. For the effort, so we'll do this one in green and this one in blue. And for the effort, the amount of effort it takes to make a big difference when you catch it early is very low. This is why we talk about stability and rapid recovery. As you get into the conscious mind side, it takes a lot more effort. So high effort on the conscious mind side, low impact, low effort, high impact on the network of neurons side. And so this is I. This is E, I should say. And this is I. And that's because at the millisecond level, when you can catch the stress response as it's working its way in, and we do this with conditioning. It's not a conscious mind or a conscious thought intervention. You're doing it with conditioning. That's why we talk about the positivity exercise. We talk about implementation intentions, transformational vocabulary. All those things work on this earlier side. And that's where we want to get to, because unlike an athlete where they're trained and they can repeat and repeat the skill to where it becomes so robust it's hard to be disrupted, we don't have that luxury as leaders. Everything we can practice, but you're not going to be able to simulate stress all the time. You literally don't have time to sit around practicing, unlike special ops in the military where they can practice over and over, and they practice with guns going off around them and explosions, and they still have to do it over and over and over with perfection. Leaders don't get to do that. What we have to do as leaders is move the stability upstream much farther than what we have expected and much farther upstream than what's typically trained. That's why stability and open skill performance. And what I'm talking about here, the sports would be a closed skill. When you have sports, you're in a closed skill. Let me just move this over. And that's why you can repeat. You can keep practicing over and over, and then you can build the system stronger with the repetition, making it more robust and more resistive to getting thrown off course. When I talk about getting thrown off course, that would be the sensation that happens when it causes a person to choke. And it's interesting because excitement and anxiety can have the same signature. So when a person is getting excited at that critical moment, it could trigger some anxiety neural pathways as well. And this is how you get that feeling like you can't suppress it. The more you suppress it, by the way, the harder it is to do anything about it. and it's aligned with emotional intelligence. It's nothing taking. It doesn't take anything away from emotional intelligence. Dynamic leadership is about moving the action points upstream, as I said. So if you think about that drawing that I had with the network of neuron side versus the conscious mind side, emotional intelligence is mostly on the conscious mind side. Now there are some things that come into play, but with dynamic leadership, we focus on the earlier, much further upstream. So if you consider driving a car without anti-lock brakes, which was the case in the 70s, maybe 80s, you didn't have anti-lock brakes, and if you started skidding, you were taught to pump the brakes. And really what you're doing is letting up on the brakes, you're feathering, but they don't call it feathering. They used to call it pumping the brakes, but you're letting the tire get traction again, because if you hold the brake down, the tire is now sliding, and a sliding tire has less traction than a rolling one. So you want to be just on that limit before it slides. And so they tell you to pump the brake. But what race car drivers would do is feather. They would just feather out because they're recognizing it's starting to slide. Traction control is very similar. Traction control cuts the power. When the tire is about to slide, it cuts the power. Again, if you're getting ready to fishtail in the car, you feather out the gas. And a lot of times when the first time fishtail, you probably overcorrected because you took your foot off the gas too soon and you turned the wheel too fast. But the point is, what traction control does is it intervenes so early that it makes the slide, it's not even noticeable. And that's what we're doing with dynamic leadership. We're taking what is known to be the case in emotional intelligence and taking all that good learning, but moving the action points far upstream so that we can stabilize even in chaos. And it's not corrective at all. It's happening so early, it appears like you're preventing anything from happening. The same way it looks like traction control prevents the fishtail, it's really just correcting the slide very, very early on, or using the anti-lock brakes. It's the same effect of feathering out of the brakes, but it's happening at the millisecond level, much faster than the conscious mind can react or respond, I should say. And then this is the 7-step reset. And the reason I call it a reset is because we're doing work here and we do work here to change the system, to update the system from when you were 0 to 7 when it was formed, and updating it slightly so that we are able to meet the speed of life that we have today with the VUCA environment: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. It's coming at us so fast with technology and all that didn't exist for the hunter gatherer. Everything was slower, and the way that the world was by the time a kid was 35, it was the same. For us, a person who's 5 years old today, the life will be very different. The world will be very different when they're 35 years old, the same way it is for a 35-year-old today. What they learned, even though there were computers around when they were 35, is nothing like what it is today. So we're always constantly having to deal with environments we're not conditioned for. What the 7-step reset does is reset that conditioning for the environment that we're in and aligned with your quest and purpose. And this is a variation of what I drew. You have the pre-listening part, that's the pre-stimulus, then the stimulus happens here. You have this first thing is readiness. An example of what you can do there early on is change your perpetual question. If a person has a perpetual question, am I right, or am I safe, or am I going to be okay here, or are they going to like me? All those kinds of perpetual questions are harmful to you being at your best. So that's the first thing you could do. That is preventive, because you're preventing from going down a wrong path. I talked about a positivity exercise. This training that we do for the subconscious or the network of neurons. So the bias is not towards everything as a threat, but the bias is towards neutral or positive. And then we have this in here, which you can do with, you start breathing, taking deep breaths, you change your attention. There's things we can do here. Implementation intentions certainly work here. Implementation intentions work here. And these, you're essentially retraining your subconscious. So it's not reacting the way you learn from 0 to 5 or 7. It's reacting the way that you've taught it to, because habits follow the path of least resistance, and that path is a neural pathway. The more you rack with myelin and the more you have synapses available, that path of least resistance can be changed. This is why they say that it's easier to replace a habit than to break a habit, because to break a habit, you're dealing with the myelination of those pathways, whereas to replace a habit, once you get that new pathway in place, the synapses falls away from the other one. The process is called synaptogenesis. It's like pruning the synapses from the unused or little used neural pathways to the more active ones. And then this is the first 600 milliseconds. So it's essentially the half second of reaction time for the conscious mind plus the pre listening of the 100 milliseconds. And then that passes on to the conscious mind and it converts it from the signal that goes to the neural pathways to something that the conscious mind can perceive. And it's a thought, could be a sensation, a feeling, an emotion, what have you. All right, so here's turning it into the leadership conversation. Leadership requires open skill performance. I talked about that a little bit in the introduction. Open skill performance is when you don't know what you're going to face. Closed skill performance is a sport. You have in tennis, you have a specific set of strokes you're going to use. You know what the dimensions of the court. You know the time. You know the score, and you can train for that. Leadership, we can't train for those things the way we can in sports. And this slide, it says the illusion of this is just how I am. The I would say the greatest obstacle I have in helping people accept that there's possibility for them is to get them out of this is just how I am. By the time a person is 50 years old, they're so locked into nothing ever worked when they tried to change. If hacks worked for a little bit, but homeostasis is just going to absorb that hack and you're right back to the status quo because we have 100 billion neurons interacting with thousands of other each interacting with thousands of other neurons. You're just not going to change it with a hack. It's going to get absorbed. We have to adjust it the way the system is designed. So results don't reflect the limits of thinking. Performance is often shaped before conscious thinking even begins. If a person has a stress response and you can feel it coming up, but it's physiological. So people they're looking for thought and the thought comes later, but that physiological part is cognitive processing. You want to get comfortable and used to feeling that sensation come up. And when it comes up. You can tell when you have telling tension, you can tell when somebody triggers a thought and you want to say something that's telling tension, or you can, if you're talking to somebody, you can see their facial expression change. You know that something is different. You don't know what it is, but you know that something changed. And as a coach, in that moment, I asked, "What's coming up for you with that?" Because I want to know right then and there. If I wait and say, "What was that?" Now the conscious mind has had a chance to engage, and it's going to philosophize and rationalize. Is going to come up with some cool answer. But if you catch it right there, you're going to get the raw thing, and it's usually an association from the past because it's the network of neuron side, and the network of neuron side is all about associations and path of least resistance. If you're talking and you say something, it's going to trigger that association, and next thing you know, they're having a stress response, and it's because of something that happened in the past. It's not even real. So people tend to assume that behavior follows thought. It's the other way around. The behavior at the physiological level, and it's not what you people think of as behavior. It's what's going on physiologically. That's going to come before thought because it hands off those associations, that path of least resistance to the conscious mind. People also assume that more knowledge improves execution. This is certainly true in leadership. And I'm not against education, the Army War College and all that. There's constantly a need to get trained. But the real work, if you follow a soldier through the process, there's training, but then the majority of it is conditioning. You have to get the basic knowledge and then you condition. People assume that inconsistency reflects character. That's like the athlete choking. We don't think that they forgot how to play. We recognize that, okay, there's a performance psychology thing, a sports psychology thing that maybe we need to be talking about. And as I said, with sports, you do have the option of so many repetitions that it makes the system more robust. You're never going to get it to the point where no external thing is ever going to impact it, but you can certainly improve it. It's sort of like the celebrities who require a controlled environment, and that way they never get shocked or surprised, and they're always in control. But then they don't have the skill to handle something when they do get knocked off course. And we know that eventually something's going to come that knocks you off course. So people rarely examine what happens before the story forms. And I would say that if I look at emotional intelligence, a lot of it comes into play as the story is forming or even after the story forms. Dynamic leadership is moving that upstream because there are things that we can do, and that's the story here. And then what sports called choking? So this is recap what I was saying. In sports, choking is not a lack of skill. It is skill disruption under pressure, because without the pressure, there's not a problem. And if you've ever been in that situation where the score is close and maybe you're ahead and you should win, and then all of a sudden you feel this anxiety, and it's almost like you can't. If you try to suppress it, it just gets worse and worse. This is why they have skills. I was a tennis player just the other day said that she was playing against a player who, and the hometown crowd was rooting for the opponent. And this player did win, and in the post game interview, she said, "Yeah, I just pretended that whenever they would cheer, and cheer that other player's name, that they were cheering for her and using her name. She played a game with herself because you can't suppress it. The point is, I would say athletes have, if they're at that elite level, they have ways of managing this that doesn't include suppression. Certainly, it's early recovery, but if you can't recover fast enough, then you need another trick, and that would be that. So that would be like a hack. I'd consider that a hack because it did work for that game, but it's not going to work forever because the system is going to adjust it the same way with affirmations that are so far from the truth, they don't really carry the power because the system normalizes. It's things are happening too fast. Muscle memory is nervous system memory. I've said that many, many times. People have no problem understanding muscle memory, but when you think of it as the same exact process that it has with thinking, with our thoughts, it's harder for people to grasp that. So muscle memory is nervous system memory. And the way you change the nervous system is you get myelination of the neurons and you make sure there's synapses. And that's the process of deep practice does that. And through that process, now the desired habit that's aligned with your quest and purpose becomes the path of least resistance. Skills are encoded in neural circuits, not muscles. That makes sense. Under stable conditions, execution feels automatic. Under threat, nervous system bias shifts output. And excess arousal alters timing, precision, and flexibility. This is all why we move the intervention upstream. And it's not an intervention somebody's doing outside. You're conditioning it in the same way that you have this conditioning that when the game gets tight and the score gets tight, you may feel this anxiety come up. Remember, anxiety and excitement have the same signature. So it could be excitement that's just triggering some anxiety. But the same way that that's happening like clockwork, you can train a different response using deep practice, using implementation intentions, using the positivity exercise so it doesn't happen in the first place, and other things. And then excess arousal alters timing, precision, and flexibility. That's what we see as choking. Yes, it makes sense when you're thinking about a sport, but it's the same thing that happens when you see a leader not show up as their best. Because remember, there's a cognitive narrowing. As we go into stress response, our cognitive abilities may be way out here, but as we get under stress, there's a narrowing of there's a cognitive narrowing which limits our ability to respond. And this is where you get leaders who just, and some people I have heard it called the person choked. You can see it with speakers. A public speaker gets a question that they're not prepared to answer. They get red, and next thing you know, that they're like fumbling with the answer because that it went past that threshold. So we have to have tools and resources. One, very, very strong on the prevention side, and even in the 7-step reset on the emotional part, we have this one right here is step 5. This is emotional modulation. So we condition in at this step with you do the conditioning, but we present the system. Condition in emotional modulation. So if this subconscious feels something coming up, like this is going to be more than a little bit, it will hold off on the response until emotional modulation is done, and is done with the response. So you might delay it for a few seconds, but then at least you're emotionally regulated before you take the action step. And this happens in less than 90 seconds. And because it happens at a habitual level, it gets faster and faster to the point where it's instantaneous. But also because you're doing things more upstream, the need to emotionally modulate becomes much, much, much less. Leadership has its own version of choking. This is what we're talking about. Leaders experience the same disruption, but we don't call it choking. Listening narrows under pressure. The already listening probably goes up. Tone sharpens without intention. Flexibility decreases. You might have a person snap. This is when I say that a leader may say they want bad news early, but their visceral reaction is so severe when the employee gives them bad news. The employee perceives that as I'm never going to do that, or responds in their mind, I'm never going to do that again, because they attach it to themselves. They attach it to bringing bad news, even though the leader wants bad news early, but they don't act like it. And so they don't get what they want. They get based on what they act. Decisions become reactive rather than deliberate. So we do spend some time with the leader, making sure that they have tools to hold off their initial reaction. And most of it is automated in at the condition and the automaticity level, but you also have to have some skills for those things to get through. When leaders don't show up as their best self under pressure, it mirrors athletic choking. So I've made that point several times now. Cognitive narrowing begins before conscious thought. So if your cognitive narrowing is already happening and then the conscious thought is there, you can see why your responses are different. This is very similar to those videos on YouTube that you see when somebody's triggering. It's basically that happening. They just cycle up. Activation rises in milliseconds. So a thousandth of a second is happening. And the narrative follows later because the conscious mind doesn't come online until a half second. So it's already had all this processing. Rapid appraisal shifts physiology, and this is why you have these early indicators. You want to start learning to pay attention. That little feeling that you get when you hear something, that's when to go at it. And a simple thing you can do is take a breath. A simple thing you can do is look to the other side, look away. A simple thing you can do is start writing a note about something else. By taking your attention off of it, you're going to set up a new set of associations. By trying to suppress it, all you're doing is building it, because the reason it's there is to teach you something, because it's conditioned, right? It's conditioned from the past. And you don't, at that moment, you're not trying to learn something from it. It's an association from the past, unless it's real time. And we can talk about that. But that's when you don't want to suppress it. You just want to look away. You want to uh, check your own question. You maybe visualize the outcome. You might visualize. I used to, when I was selling life insurance, and I got that moment, the person came up with an objection that felt like a little bit more, I wasn't ready for it. I would just immediately, this is back in the days with checks were more prevalent, I would immediately visualize them signing the check. Now, for years, I didn't understand why that was happening. I didn't understand what the visualization role is. And that's how you can see people get into this manifestation thing. I'm visualizing them writing the check. What was actually happening to me, I was calming my system down. I was getting off of that tense, that stress moment. I do the same thing when I on motorcycle trips, especially these long. I used to do these long trips. I'd ride like 500-600 miles on the highway to get to the mountains because I lived in Chicago, flatlands. We'd ride to the mountains for 500 or 600 miles, then spend 3 days riding the twisties, and then we'd ride back. So during that time, you're just, droning along on the highway. And it's easy for, especially if somebody cuts you off or whatever, you start thinking about an accident can happen. I would just immediately think about pulling into my driveway, seeing my kids greet me when I got home and things like that. And I do the same if I have to speak to a group. I immediately start visualizing a standing ovation at the end of it. And it just calms the system down. You can do that with everything. You're in a proposal, things are not going your way. Just start visualizing the person nodding the head. You're not manifesting the outcome. You're stabilizing and correcting. This is what's called rapid recovery. This is what I meant when I said the impact is very high at the beginning if you catch it early, and the effort is really low. It's not much effort. I just visualize something. But if you wait until the conscious mind side, it takes a lot of work to get that under regulation, and that's where you see. And then once it turns into a biological event, feeling, then it's really, if you got cortisol flowing through your body and all that, it's real difficult to get that tapered in a matter of minutes. So that's a great example of how the effort goes up with time and the impact goes down. But if you catch it early, as simple as taking a breath in through your nose, out through your mouth, and because it's measuring in milliseconds, you take just a 2-second inhale it's already going to start managing that. But you also do things, like I said, conditioning it proactively. So, like traction control, you don't even get the sensation, which is ideal. So, activation rises in milliseconds, narrative follows later. Let's see. Yeah, so bandwidth reduces before language forms. The story construction attempts to justify the state. So, the longer you wait with yourself, the more the story is going to form around your feeling. Tomorrow I'll talk about how this works when you're leading people. It's the same thing. The longer you wait, the more they're going to rationalize that feeling. At the extreme, people will change the facts to match their feelings because they just have to have that congruity inside it. They don't recognize that the network of neurons is not them. It's just associations from the past. And so because they think it's them and they think that that impulse that came across transitioned into a thought. They think that that's their thinking and that's true. And so then they start reacting to it and they rationalize around it. And the next thing you know, they're off on some story that makes no sense and you have a hard time getting them back. So when you're leading others, the same way you can feel that tension come up inside, you can spot it in the other person and you'll get better and better. You can't tell what it is, but you can tell that something shift. And that's why in the onboarding meeting, I talk about calibrating. When you have that early in the employment cycle meeting, that onboarding meeting, you're creating a safe environment. You get to calibrate what this person looks like when they're explaining things, when they feel comfortable, when they feel safe. And that enables you to spot very quickly when something shifts. And then you could ask that question, what's coming up for you? Or, oh, yeah, so let me hear you. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, but do it quickly or early in the process before they can rationalize around it. Because remember, that's happening at the first half second level. Once you wait a few seconds, they're going to be rationalizing it. You'll get a different answer. The real constraint is state stability. So it's not skill. Yes, you need knowledge. Yes, you need skill. But once you get to a certain point, it's about performance. This is why they say a mediocre plan with great execution will outperform an excellent plan with poor execution because execution is this. That's what we're talking about. Most leadership development improves skill. Few systems improve regulation under load. We just don't train that. For centuries, we've thought of the network of neurons as a mind. So that wasn't something that was even accessible to train. Now that we know it is, we have to get people understanding how to do that. And that's what we do in this work. Dynamic leadership. Knowledge does not prevent early activation. You have to have more than knowledge. It's not insights. You can get so far with insights, but you're not going to get the conditioning happening because it's conditioning, it's not knowledge. You have to go beyond knowledge and do the conditioning steps. And it's not a lot. It's 3 sets a day, 3 reps per set. Do it for, it takes 90 seconds. You do that for 6 weeks and you'll see your life start to change. You'll see it changing before the 6 weeks, but 6 weeks is needed to make sure it's going to work on a bad day of a bad week. Conscious strategies arrive after appraisal. That's the important point. That's why this is moving upstream. And then you're doing corrective. It's a lot easier to put the toothpaste where the toothpaste tube where you want it before squeezing it rather than squeezing it and then trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube. State dependent competence explains inconsistency. This is the point I made that if an athlete chokes, we don't say they forgot how to play. We know that something went wrong inside their head, and that's the work here. Early detection increases access to stored capability. And what we're doing with this early detection and rapid recovery, we're pushing the cognitive wider rather than letting it narrow. We're pushing it back out. And the sooner you catch it, the easier it is to push it out. If it gets here, it gets harder and harder to push it out. But if you catch it early and you just keep pushing it out, and even that becomes a habit because everything you do on that side is having the effect of myelinating neurons. And once they become the path of least resistance, the system follows that instead of something else. You're literally working the system the way it was designed. That's why I call it a reset. Change becomes possible when leaders learn to stabilize earlier, not when they learn more. I'm not against leadership development, as I said. You have to have knowledge. In fact, my workshop starts with knowledge because you have to have the understanding, or it's like pushing a snowball uphill. Closed skill versus open skill performance, just as a recap, leaders operate in unpredictable, socially complex environments where repetition of the exact moment is impossible. So you can't train to the point where you're not going to make a mistake. It's not like in the military special ops where they're able to train, they set up the building, they set up the system, that the wherever they're going to do the execution, they set up the whole little town and they know exactly what to do, and they're throwing off explosions and shooting guns, and all kinds of things are going on, and they're making changes real time. The timing, you got to go faster, and they're literally practicing over and over how to do this in all sorts of environments, which is why they can do it so reliably. Athletic performance often occurs in defined, repeatable scenarios. That's a closed system. Repetition builds context specific procedural robustness, and that's the key. We're moving to procedure instead of discipline or willpower, and that's what we're doing with dynamic leadership. We're making the system more robust, not with repetition, but with procedures that are at the subconscious level. Leadership operates in dynamic, interpersonal, high ambiguity environments, and that's why I use the metaphor analogy of traction control, because traction control, especially dynamic traction control, is going to work whether you're on a hill, in a turn, on sand, water, ice. It's always going to work because it's adjusting, it's constantly adjusting very, very early in the cycle. Since you can't rehearse every difficult conversation, conflict, or unexpected escalation, we're going to have skills to regulate on the fly. And you're not regulating your rapid recovery. These are rapid recoveries. That shifts the leverage point from skill volume to recovery speed. Remember, it's at the millisecond level. And if it's at that millisecond level, it's got to be conditioning. You're not going to do that consciously. So if leadership is an open skill domain, then regulation under load, not more knowledge, becomes the primary driver of consistent execution. This is, in the case of transformation, this is what we're doing. We're moving from the comfort zone through the stories, through the bad experiences, through all the conditioning, the cognitive dissonance that happens, and we're breaking through to the other side. This is the inner work that's needed. It's not inner work because there's something wrong with you. It's inner work because this is the conditioning that was formed from 0 to 7, whatever it is. That's why you can have twins grow up in the same household and they have different uh, barriers that they have to deal with, because it's just how they processed it. It's how they process their environment. But you have to cross through this barrier. And once you cross through the barrier, now you're into a new situation. You're into the unfamiliar and the unknown, which is a threat to the subconscious. And so you need a set of skills. This is where we talk about methodical and consistency and simplicity. So you're using principles, you're following principles, so you're not reacting to all the VUCA, the threats and the opportunities that come. Now, same slide essentially, but have a plan before the threat is the idea. And that, knowing that there's this difficulty up here, you're not going to react to every single thing. You're following a set of principles. This is why you hear people say, trust the process, just trust the process. It's similar to that. You just trust it, but you build it based on that. And this, I go live. It's usually early 7 or 8, but I'm using these live events to flesh out some of the details with dynamic leadership. And sometimes I just get deep into the research and we'll have to postpone the live. So I don't want to promise the times, but I'll typically update the 7stepreset.com/live. I was traveling and didn't do that last week. And then we have a workshop on this Thursday where I'm teaching this. This is actually a practical workshop live where we practice the steps. So you leave there with the levers and drivers, not all the levers and drivers, but you've been able to experience and apply them to your quest. So it's interactive, it's all live, no AI, and it's working on your quest. So the beginning of it, we design a proxy for your vision or purpose or quest if you don't already have one. And that proxy is what we use through the system. If you do already have one, we may shift it to just the on-ramp part to keep the thing small enough, because we want to learn the skills in a safe environment. So we keep it like that. And that is a wrap for today. Tomorrow I'll cover the similar content, but it'll be applied to leading others. The same way that, as I said, the same way we can sense when that anxiety is coming up in ourselves. I'm not talking the after the anxiety is off and running. I'm talking about that first little tinge of there's a feeling, that little that small one. That's when we want to notice in ourselves, and it's just shortly after that, milliseconds after that, well before it becomes a story. You can see the person facial expressions change, but you may see their breathing change early. You may see them rise up, or they flush, or their eyes go down. They just something changes, and that's the moment you want to see what's coming up. And you have your own way of saying it, but you say, yeah. So this is the point I usually stop to see how this is going in. What's going on for you here, whatever that is, and catch it early. All right, but we'll do that in the workshop, and that's at you can go to 7stepreset.com/mastery, and you can sign up there. And it's this Thursday, the 26th at 8 a.m. We go all day. A money back guarantee if you are not satisfied that this has given you tools to show up as the best version of yourself more consistently. Obviously, you're not going to have the entire skill set down at the end of the workshop, just like a football player is not going to understand every single play the day they show up at a team meeting, but you'll have some skills to start making progress, and then make